Hello, guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Top, well, in this case, 14 Worst Bases in the Game. As you guys know from past top worst videos, I don't tend to rank them because, well, I don't like to compare turds. And that's pretty much what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at some of the bases of Diablo 2, which tend to be some of the worst bases in Diablo 2 for various reasons. There are 14 of them total that I've managed to collect, and honestly, there actually is technically a little bit more than that, because I kind of finagled the rules here or there by a little bit. But we're going to start out with axes, and we're going to start out with probably the worst axe base by far, which is the Warspike, also aka known as the crowbill or the military pick. You may have in your time never actually used a warspike, crowbill, or military pick, except for maybe like Tankreds, and even then probably only at low levels. And the reason is because it is actually one of the worst bases in Diablo 2. It has one of the lowest average damages out of all of the elite axes. As you can see here, 45.5 even for the Tomahawk, which is still very low, you know, considering that like the Etnax has 49.5, but the Warspike has the lowest average damage out of all of the elite axe bases for one-handed. It's just an absolutely garbage item. The only redeeming factor that it has is its 6 sockets, but I don't know why you would ever use this over the Berserker's axe, which also has 6 sockets and has a much better average damage in general. It just doesn't make any sense why you would choose one over the other. Also, it only has 26 durability, like most of the axes in the one-handed axe category, which also is another big detriment. I mean, all of the axes have this problem, but at least some of the axes are actually worth using. This one has low durability and low damage, and not a lot going for it. It's also a mid-range weapon at 1, which the lowest would be 0, and the highest for the one-handed category is +2, which is technically 3. So that's 1 for the base, essentially, because how the range adder works is you always have 1 base, and then the range adder is adding to that base. So in this particular case, the Berserker's Axe is a 3 range, and the Warspike is a 2 range, and the Tomahawk would be a 1 range total. Next on the list is the Feral Axe. The Feral Axe is another one of the two-handed axes, and it's probably the worst out of all of the two-handed axes. The average damage on the two-handed axes is actually really good. You can look at like the Glorious Axe has 92 average, the Decapitator has 93 average, and so forth and so on. And even the Champion Axe has 76.5, which is halfway decent. But the Feral Axe is at 74, and it only has a possibility of 4 sockets, which precludes it from being able to be used for things like a Death, a Breath of the Dying, or basically a lot of the really good melee rune words, which tend to require more than 4 sockets. So the Feral Axe tends to be just one of the worst bases, and this includes pretty much all of its Presquisites too. So that would include the Military Axe and the Large Axe, which are both the lower tier bases of this item. The next one on the list is in the Swords category, and that would be the Falcata. The Falcata has decent average damage at 45, but its main issue is that it's not a very fast weapon and it doesn't have very many sockets. It only has 2 sockets total. It tends to be one of those weird items that doesn't really have a lot of place in the rune word category for actually making good rune words, and on top of that, it doesn't really have the best average damage in the normal and the exceptional category. And even in the elite category, where it does have a decent amount of damage, it tends to be outpaced by better options like the Phase Blade, the Conquest Sword, the Cryptic Sword, the Mythical Sword, that have essentially just better overall setups, allowing them to 4, 3, or even 6 sockets, which at least allows them to use things like Plague or the Crescent Moon. You can't even put a Plague or a Crescent Moon in a Falcata. And the same also applies to the Ataghan, the Cutlass, the scimitar, also the Elegant Blade, the sabre, and the shamshir. They're just all awful one-handed swords. They only have a grip possibility of 2 sockets on all of them, and they don't really have any speciality that makes them like better than the others. Like the Ataghan is a -20 base, right? Well, it's not better than the phase blade that has a negative 30 base. So if you're looking for a very fast weapon, you wouldn't choose an Ataghan, you would choose a phase blade because it's indestructible and it's faster. So it doesn't really have any speciality at all. The Hydra Edge was close to making this list, but the Hydra Edge is actually the highest damage sword, even though it is also the slowest. And there are some usable things for it, like if you were to find a really good, like, ethereal, Hydra Edge with, like, Fool's Cruels of the quickness, it could actually be a pretty crazy weapon because the average damage on it is so high, which makes it actually one of the best damage swords in the one-handed category. Actually, out of all of them, you can see, like, only 45, 45, 33, 48 ends up being the highest. So you end up with some very interesting scenarios with the Hydra Edge, which just barely keeps it out of the worst rune words. I'm not going to say it's the best. I mean, the best base. I'm not going to say it's the best. It's definitely nowhere near the best. But it manages to scrape itself out of the worst category. But only just. Only just. Moving on to the staves. All of the staves are actually fairly usable, except for 2 of them. So because the Elder Staff, the Shillelagh, and the Archon Staff all have 4, 4, and 6 sockets, respectively, all of them are essentially useful. However, when you go back and you look at even, like, the normal quality ones, the theme follows the entire way through, which means that long staves and short staves, as well as the Joe stave and quarterstaff, and the walking stick and the stalagmite stick, tend not to be very useful for much. You can use early on a short staff for a leaf rune word, but leaf is hardly an endgame best in slot piece of equipment. I mean, you could potentially use it for pre-buffing at some point, but it falls away rather quickly. And since staves tend to be used for specific rune words, like you can find an ethereal shillelagh, and you could put an insight in it, and you can just run around beating the crap out of something with high damage for a little while until it breaks. Or, you could make, like, a Breath of Dying in an Archon staff. You could make memory in pretty much any of these that make a really good memory buff stick. But, like, you can't do any of that with the stalagmite or the walking stick, which make them just absolutely horrible in terms of their base type for usability. In fact, most of the times when you find these, even if you were to find, like, a +3 energy shield walking stick, well, it still basically has no usefulness because there's nothing you can do with it. And the same thing goes for the stalagmite because there are no 3-socket staff rune words, as far as I'm aware. So just completely useless in general. Granted, you could still find, like, a rare or, like, a blue that has, like, godlike stats, but for the most part, in those cases, you're generally looking at orbs instead. And orbs can basically have the same exact stats that the staves have. So, like, if you were looking for, like, a +3 lightning skills with +3 lightning mastery and +3 nova, you're much better off using an orb for that. Moving on to the maces. Oops, wrong category. Maces. So in the mace category, there's really not a lot bad in this category. We do have 2 mace types, which are kind of poopy. One is the Truncheon, which is average damage 39. It only has 2 sockets. It's not a very good base type. It has one of the lower average damages on the entire field, and it tends to, with those 2 sockets, be relatively useless for most scenarios. The same thing goes for the Reinforced Mace. The Reinforced Mace also has the same problem of 2 sockets, but it does actually have better average damage. So it could potentially pull itself out of the worst category, but it's still not really by much. It's scraping out of the worst category at this point. As far as the mallets go, like, none of them are really that bad. Pretty much all the mallets are decent. Moving on to the next one on the list, we have daggers. So I wanted to say, like, that I could pick one of these, or pick 2 of them, or pick 3 of them, but the truth is that they're all terrible. Like, they're all terrible. The only one that's even remotely usable is the Fanged knife, and the Fanged knife is only usable because it has 3 sockets. If you look at the bone knife, it has a sockets of 1, which means you can put no rune words in it. In the mithril point is a sockets of 1. You can put no rune words in it. A legend spike has sockets of 2, and you can put no rune words in it. And this follows along the entire way, with the exceptionals also being 11132, and the normal daggers also being 1132. Which basically means that they're all pretty much useless. Another big issue is their durability, which they all have relatively low durability, except for the mithril point for some reason, which has 55 durability, which I don't really understand why. But in general, like, they just tend to be one of the worst base types in the game. Even the damage output that they offer is really low. 36 average, 39 average. When you compare that to a sword, most of the swords had, what, 45 average? So the mithril point's the only one that really has 45 average, but then again only has 1 socket, so you can't really do anything with it. I mean, I can't tell you, like, a character that actually used any of these daggers and enjoyed his time using them, except for maybe, like, my dual ethereal zodded flesh ripper fang knife barbarian. That's probably the only one that I could say. So pretty much all of the dagger bases are garbage, with the exception of maybe the fang knife, because it's the only one that has 3 sockets, and it's the only one that can have, like, plague or basically any rune word in it whatsoever. Moving on to the claws. So when it comes to the claws, there's really no bad type. However, it like, for instance, if you were making a mosaic claw, just using mosaic as an example, the Sawaya, the wrist sword, the feral claws, the runic talons, the scissor Sawaya, they are all good bases for mosaic. The only ones that don't work are the Warfist and the Battle Cestus, which only have 2 sockets. In general, I tend not to see anybody using the punch fists, mainly because, number 1, you can't actually put any rune words in them. Number 2, they're the slowest out of all of the weapons, which is actually by a significant margin, because the Warfist is actually positive 10. And pretty much all the other ones are either 0 or negative 10 or even faster than that. So they tend to be the slowest of the bases as well. Now, the Warfist does have at least the 48.5 average damage, which could potentially make it useful if you happen to find, like, a god tier rare Warfist with Fool's Cruels of the Quickness and had, like, Eth Rep or something, and you could just, like, make the most godlike damage claw ever. But outside of, like, a really good rare Warfist, these 2 punch claws are kind of like the absolute worst paces of the assassin. Mainly because most of the time you won't find any of them worth using. They tend to be too slow to actually use compared to the other ones, which are all well and clearly faster. Especially things like the runic talons, which have negative 30 if you're looking for a really fast base. The Battle Cestus doesn't even have superior damage output to a lot of the other options. Like, when you look at the wrist sword, which has 39.5 average and negative 10, the Battle Cestus is only 39 average with negative 10, so it's missing 0.5 damage over the wrist sword. And that's just a equivalent option, whereas when you get into some of the faster options, like the runic talons, which have negative 30 base, like, it just goes kind of crazy there. And then the scissor Sawaya, which are the same 0 as, like, the Sawayas up here, like 45.5 average, 45.5 average, and these are only 39. So the punch claws tend to be some of the worst claws on the assassin. There are some uses for them, but they definitely belong in the worst category. Shields. So moving on to our shieldy boys. In the shield category, most of the shields are, like, okay. Like, for instance, Troll's Nest is fine. You can make lots of cool things in the Troll's Nest. Ward is not, like, the greatest shield in the world, but definitely fine for an early spirit if you want it. It's not the preferred spirit, but it's fine as a spirit for the characters. The Blade Barrier, absolutely fine for, like, pretty much anything. Rhyme, Sanctuary, Dreams, like, fine. Monarch, of course, is the choice for spirits. And then Hyperion's actually not half bad either. The main problem shields are, number 1, the heater, which only has 2 sockets, and tends to be one of the worst types of shields, which means you can't really put hardly anything in it. You can't put Ancient's Pledge, you can't put Sanctuary, you can't put Spirit, you can't put Dream, you can't put Dragon, you can't put hardly nothing in this shield. Luna also, likewise, has only 2 sockets. So same exact problem with the Luna is you can't put hardly nothing in the shield to actually make it worthwhile. Another one that's absolutely terrible, although it does have 4 sockets, is the Aegis. The Aegis is... I'm not really sure what they were thinking with this shield. It doesn't really have a huge benefit to wear it, which is really weird because if you look at the max defense right here, right, so this is the max defense column. The Troll's Nest, which only has a strength requirement of 106, has a maximum defense of 173. Whereas the Aegis, which has a strength requirement of 219 and also comes with the heavy classification, has a defense of 161, which is below the Troll's Nest. You would think that the Aegis would be higher defense than any other shield, being the tankiest and like brawniest shield to hold. Like you literally got to be like Hercules to hold this shield, right? So it should be thick and broad like a dwarven shield. But no, it doesn't even outpace things like the Troll's Nest or the Ward, which are lighter versions of the same shield. It also comes with the heavy penalty, which means you run slower when you're holding it. And it's not even better block chance than shields like the Ward or the Hyperion, which both have 54%. So it doesn't really offer any actual benefit to using this big giant Herkajerg battle jitney because it sucks. Way too high strength requirement, way too many penalties involved for essentially no gain. So you're just not going to use that base. Moving on to the armors, there's not really a lot of bad armors. Armors are pretty generic. They have they have defense. They come with sockets. Pretty much all the armors come with 4 sockets for elite bases. When you're looking at the exceptional armors, I mean, pretty much every armor that matters comes with 3 sockets or 4 sockets. And the ones that only come with 2 tend to be useful for what they're useful for, which is like early stealth armors. So there's nothing necessarily wrong with any of the early armors. They're perfectly fine. The only ones that are really bad, honestly, are in the elite section. And it really just comes down to this one plate right here. This is like the worst one out of the lot. It offers essentially no benefit to use over the Sacred Armor. The Sacred Armor is 600 maximum defense, and the Shadow Plate is 557. The strength requirement on the Shadow Plate is 230, and the strength requirement on the Sacred Armor is 232. So you can increase your defense, your maximum defense on the Sacred Armor by, 43, and only the strength requirement by 2. Another big difference between the Sacred Armor and the Shadow Plate is that the Shadow Plate is a heavy armor, which reduces your run walk speed a lot. Whereas the Sacred Armor is only a medium class armor, which doesn't reduce your run walk speed as much. So you get essentially all the benefit of having the top tier armor by not having the heavy qualification. Everything else from there, like the Lacquered Plate, just barely squeaks itself out of the worst. The Hellforge Plate also just barely squeaks itself out of the worst. Mainly it's just because it has a lower strength requirement. Also, it looks pretty. But for the most part, pretty much every single one of the armors except for the Shadow Plate tends to be fine to use. Not exactly the best, but the Shadow Plate definitely makes it into the worst category just simply because it offers no benefit to actually use it, and it's not better than its next cousin, which is the Sacred Armor. We move on to the helmets. So the helmets is a odd category. It's one that a lot of people don't really know a lot about. You can make pretty much any rune word in the Spired Helm, the Demon Head, and the Corona and the Bone Visage. The Bone Visage and the Corona tend to be the best in terms of your like sorceresses, pretty much any character, because they have relatively low strength requirement and they have relatively high defense combined with the fact that they can make 3 sockets. So when it comes to helmets, like all of the 3 socket variants are useful. The Bone Visage, the Corona, the Demon Head, and even the Spired Helm with 192 strength is very useful because you can have an ethereal version of it and you can get a really nice like Spired Helm, like bulwark and put it on your mercenary. The ones up at the top here, though, are all stuck at 2 sockets. The Shako is 2 sockets, the hydraskull is 2 sockets, the Armet is 2 sockets, and the giant Conch is 2 sockets. These are all absolutely horrible because you can't put any of the rune words in them. You can't put Delirium in there, you can't put Dream in there, you can't put Cure in there, or Bulwark in there, or it's just all of the rune words that are actually worth using on helmets are 3 socket rune words. And none of these helmets have 3 sockets, so you can actually use them as 3 socket rune words. So they tend to be among the worst helmet bases. Like when you see a Shako or hydraskull or Armet or giant Conch drop, you generally just ignore them or take them back to sell them for 35k in the bank. If you're really early in a ladder and you happen to see like a 2 socket hydraskull or like a 2 socket Shako drop, sure, you can pick them up and make a lore helmet. But for the most part, nobody touches the damn things. They're not useful at end game, and they're barely useful in the beginning of the game. If you're lucky and you find like a really good rare in these setups with like these elites, they're okay. But in just about every category, when you look at them, they always have only 2 socket requirements. Even in the normal variety, they only go up to 2 sockets, and all the other helmets go up to 3. With the Bone Helm actually doesn't go up to 3 in normal difficulty, but that's fine. And I think that's pretty much it. The Amazon weapons, pretty much every Amazon weapon is useful, including the matriarchs. The sorceress orbs, there's literally like no difference between any of these. The sockets don't matter because there's no rune words that actually go in them. And when you're looking for the orbs, you're pretty much just looking at the overall stats on them, which is not really important. Necromancer heads, same sort of thing. Like 2 sockets is the maximum for every single necromancer head, and it doesn't really matter. Theoretically, the wands do have a limitation because there are some wands that have 1 socket. Most wands have 2 sockets, and they can make things like white in them, which is a relatively useful rune word. I wouldn't necessarily put these on the worst list. They could be runners up to the worst list, but if you look at all of the normal quality wands, they only have 1 socket for the U wand and the wand. However, the Bone Wand and the Grim Wand both have 2, and when you go into the exceptionals, only the Burnt Wand has only 1 socket in the exceptional category. So technically, some of the wands do only have 1 socket and therefore have limited usefulness, but it doesn't really matter because a wand is really about the stats that are on the wand in most cases. So the fact that these wands can't get more than 1 socket doesn't really matter, because if you find like a +2 necromancer with +3 skeleton mastery and like +3 to skeleton warrior or whatever, like you're not really going to care. You're still going to use it because it's going to be a +5 skeleton warrior, +5 skeleton mastery, and you're just going to use it. So I'm not even really sure I could add those into the worst list. Throwing items, pretty much all the throwing items are fine. There's like nothing wrong with any of the throwing items. Some of them have low damage, but they also have fast speed, and some of them have high damage but low speed, and so forth and so on. And none of that is nothing wrong with any of that. For the pole arms, I didn't really find any of the pole arms to be horrible. I was looking at all of them, and the only one that I was even considering was the Ogre Axe. But with the advent of things like Hustle, a nice ethereal Ogre Axe for your mercenary isn't exactly terrible. Spears, very similarly, like I was considering the Hyperion Spear, but again, a nice ethereal Hyperion Spear with a Hustle in it certainly isn't an awful choice. I think that pretty much covers everything. The scepters are all good. Like, there's nothing wrong with any of the scepters, really. You can find really good scepters, like rare scepters. This is similar to the wands, so even though the sockets isn't really the greatest, it's not like this is a base type that only rolls the, like effects on it, right? So like the actual stats. Since these are technically class items can roll pretty much anything on them, and you could potentially find a god tier rare mighty scepter even though it only has 2 sockets, which is absolutely fine. None of the scepter bases are really awful in any way, shape, or form. They tend to be pretty decent weapons, and then the skills coming in on top of that just makes them kind of OP. You could maybe include the Mighty Scepter base as like one of the worst, but I probably wouldn't. Barbarian Helms, what's not to like? They're all OP. They're all 3 sockets. Not a single one of them is only capable of 2 sockets. So literally nothing wrong with any of these helmets. Druid Pelts, same thing. literally no 2-socket variants. So there are no bad druid pelts. The only downside of some of the lower tier druid pelts is lack of defense, but that's about it. Paladin shields, there's no really bad paladin shield. Pretty much all the paladin shields can roll 45 res, and they all have fairly decent stats. Yes, some of the paladin shields would be worse than others, like a regular Tars is definitely worse than a sacred Tars, but it's also only a level requirement of 3, so how are we really comparing them? If anything, the worst of the elite shields is definitely the Vortex, with a very low block chance. It's got the worst block chance out of all of the elite shields, and honestly, the Sacred Targe tends to be the better one with the 60% block chance. There's really not a lot of difference between them, though, so I can't really like take any one of them and say that they belong on the worst bases list or anything, because they don't. Like, they're all close enough together in such a way that like there's really no big difference between any of them. Like, if you had a 45 all-res Zakharum shield and you wanted to make some cool Runewood in it, like say you wanted to make a Dream in it, or you wanted to make like you had an Ethereal one and you wanted to make an Exile or something, and people are like, oh man, I don't know if I should use Zakharum shield base. Like, it really doesn't matter. Like, I gotta tell you that the differences between these shields are so minimal that at the end of the day, like, it's not gonna make that big of a difference for your character. So like, I can't even say any of these are bad, to be honest, and that pretty much covers everything. So the full list is right here if you guys want to see it. The worst bases: the Warspike Crowbill, the Feral Axe, the Falcata, the Ataghan, the Elegant Blade, the Walking Stick, Stalagmite Staff, the Truncheon, pretty much all the daggers. You could potentially exclude just the Fanged Knife, because it does have 3 sockets, but that's about it. Pretty much all the punch type claws, the Aegis, the Heater, and Luna, which are both 2-socket max, the Shadow Plate, the Shako, hydraskull, Armet, Giant Conch. These are all 2-socket max helmets that basically have no usefulness. And that pretty much brings us up to 14 total, although I did kind of cheat a little bit by combining some of them together. Let me know what you guys think about the bases. Which ones do you think are worse? Did I add anything to the list that you felt it didn't belong on the top 14 worst bases in Diablo 2? And that's pretty much it. As always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watching. Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe button if you enjoy the content. And as always, keep watching.